The assessment folder has a date. The supplier's access does not stay on that date. Between the photograph and the incident, identities were added, digital certificates were stored in one place, and client environments shared one pipe. The folder still said current. The assessment was current. The trust had already moved. Those two sentences name one failure. We scored a date, and the access left that date. Risk drift is the gap that opens after the assessment date. We photograph a supplier on a Tuesday. After that Tuesday, identities get added, digital certificates get centralized, segregation gets weaker, and one pipe starts carrying many client environments. The folder does not move with those changes. The access does. Third-party risk management has to watch that gap after the photograph. TPRM that files a current assessment and misses the identities added after the assessment date will inherit whatever those identities can reach. A current stamp can still hide a missing list. We have to hold an inventory of identities and digital certificates that matches today's access, not last year's photograph. Risk drift is not a feeling about the vendor. Risk drift is a change in what the supplier can still do after we already scored the firm. An identity that was not on the roster appears. A digital certificate that used to sit with the client moves into a shared store. A test environment starts using the same private keys as production. A one-to-many pipe is built so several client environments can share infrastructure. Each of those changes is a new reach. The assessment date cannot see a reach that arrived after the assessment date. Identities are the first place drift shows. A staff login is added for a project. A service account is created for a nightly job. A contractor is given a console because a ticket ran long. The written contract still names the same company. The set of people and machines that can act as the supplier is already larger than the set we recorded. We do not need a new invoice for that change. We need a current list of those identities. Digital certificates and private keys are the second place. A digital certificate is the identity a rail or a client environment will accept. The private key is the secret that makes that identity usable. When those objects move from the client's own store into one cabinet at the supplier, every client on that cabinet now shares one failure. Centralization is efficient. Centralization is also a single drawer that many institutions already depend on in order to send an honest order. Segregation is the third place. We scored a design that kept test away from production and signing away from transport. After the assessment date, those walls get thinner because operations want one store and one team. A weaker wall is not a new vendor. A weaker wall is the same vendor with a larger blast radius. The folder still describes the wall we were shown. The fourth place is the one-to-many pipe. One supplier is cheaper than a pipe per client. Several client environments then share infrastructure, digital certificates, and connectivity. A compromise at the supplier is no longer one book. It is every client environment on that pipe. Concentration of that kind is not a logo preference. Concentration is a single object sitting in front of many reserve accounts. An assessment date is a photograph of delegated authority on one day. The photograph is useful. The photograph is structurally blind to risk drift. The form can be complete, the score can be current, and the access can already be a different shape. An annual review, or any point-in-time assessment, is built to close. The work ends when the folder is filed. Risk drift does not end when the folder is filed. The calendar that asked for a stamp does not know that an identity was added in May, that digital certificates were centralized in July, or that 2 client environments were joined in October. A control would rescope when those events landed. A habit waits for next year's assessment date. The folder stays on the assessment date. After that date, identities appear that the photograph never named. Digital certificates collect in one store. A shared pipe ties several client environments to one supplier. The stamp does not update. The access does. On June 30th, 2025, C&M software was compromised. C&M software was a central bank authorized PSTI, a payment service technology provider, connecting client institutions to PIX and to SPB. Public reporting described a valid staff login as the entry. The folder on the client side could still have said current. The access had already moved. C&M software was a certified supplier. Client institutions had already accepted that authorization as a reason to trust the pipe. An assessment that scored the authorization, the policy binder, and last year's architecture would have stayed green. Risk drift does not wait for a certification to expire. Identities, digital certificates, and shared infrastructure can change while the certificate on the wall is still valid. Those clients had no current inventory of the identities and digital certificates that the supplier could use in their name. Without that inventory, we cannot say who can act as us, where the private keys sit, or how many client environments share the same store. A folder that says current is not a list. A list is a list. Revocation was not unilateral. Connectivity itself went through the supplier. A client that wanted to cut a digital certificate still needed the same pipe to reach SPB, or needed the Central Bank of Brazil to suspend the connection for every client on that pipe. Time to revoke stretched because the object we needed to cut was also the object that carried honest traffic. Public estimates later described a sector halt on that connection and reserve account movement at more than one institution. Treat those figures as public estimates. The life cycle fact does not need the last digit. The life cycle fact is that we could not revoke on our own clock. Inventory is a current list of identities, digital certificates, private keys, and client environments that the supplier can still reach. It is dated today. It is not last year's photograph. A current inventory would have shown identities added after the assessment date. It would have shown digital certificates and private keys sitting in one store at the supplier, not at each client. It would have shown several client environments sharing one pipe into PIX and SBB. It would have shown segregation that was weaker than the design we scored. It would have shown reserve accounts behind that shared store. Those are facts a folder can miss while still saying current. Watching drift means we rescope when access changes. A new identity is a new scope. A digital certificate that moves into a shared store is a new scope. A second client environment joining the same pipe is a new scope. The written contract should require notice of those changes. Notice is not a courtesy. Notice is the event that restarts the assessment. Watching drift also means evidence that matches the lenses we already use. If the lens is identity, the artifact is today's enrollment list, not a policy sentence. If the lens is cryptography, the artifact is a list of digital certificates and the hosts that can use the private keys. If the lens is concentration, the artifact is a count of client environments on the same infrastructure. Age belongs on each artifact. A complete folder with last year's evidence is still a photograph. Watching drift also means a revoke path that was rehearsed. We have to know, before the incident, whether we can deactivate a digital certificate without waiting for the supplier's connectivity. We have to know who can issue a replacement, who can tell the rail to stop accepting the old object, and how long that sequence takes when the supplier is the path. A playbook that assumes we can cut on our own clock is not a rehearsal if the connectivity still goes through the same firm. Time to revoke is a number we measure in a drill, not a sentence we write after the debit. A current inventory would have named the identities, the digital certificates, and the shared pipe before June 30th. Time to revoke would have been a number we already knew, because we had rehearsed a cut that did not depend on the supplier's own connectivity. Risk drift is what those two objects catch. The folder that said current did not. Thank you.